The native girls saved the veteran rancher, or maybe they just needed him alive a little longer. The rope was already around his neck when they found him. 3 shadows moving through the pre-dawn darkness like spirits sent to collect a debt that had been 43 years in the making. Whether they saved him, or simply needed him alive a little longer, would become the question that haunted Samuel Harrison for the rest of his numbered days. The old cottonwood tree behind his ranch house had been calling to him for weeks, its thick branches promising an end to the nightmares that had grown worse with each passing winter. At 71, Samuel had outlived every man he had ever served beside, every horse he had ever broken, and every reason he could think of to continue drawing breath in a world that had forgotten both his name and his crimes. The 3 native women materialized from the Wyoming darkness like manifestations of his guilty conscience, their horses moving with the silent precision of hunters who had tracked their prey across decades instead of miles. The youngest dismounted first, her movements fluid and purposeful as she approached the tree where Samuel stood balanced on an overturned barrel, the noose tight against his weathered throat. "Samuel Two Bears Harrison," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who knew secrets that could destroy kingdoms. "You will step down from that tree and you will live, because we have need of you, and your death would serve no one." Samuel's hands trembled on the rope as recognition crashed through him like lightning. Two Bears, the name Dancing Star had given him during their secret ceremonies, the name that marked him as adopted into her clan despite the color of his skin. No one had spoken that name aloud in over 4 decades, and hearing it now from the lips of a stranger felt like resurrection and damnation rolled into one impossible moment. "Who are you?" Samuel rasped, his voice hoarse from months of speaking only to the wind and the ghosts that gathered around his bed each night. "How do you know that name?" The second woman stepped forward, and Samuel could see in the moonlight that she carried a medicine bag decorated with symbols he recognized from his dreams. "We are the granddaughters of Dancing Star," she said, her tone matter-of-fact despite the magnitude of her words. "We are the children of the promise you made and broke, the legacy of the love you abandoned when you chose cowardice over courage." The words hit Samuel like physical blows, driving the breath from his lungs and bringing tears to eyes that had been dry for so long he had forgotten they could weep. Dancing Star, the woman whose memory had sustained him through decades of exile, and whose loss had driven him to this tree, this rope, this final act of surrender to the guilt that had consumed him from the inside out. "She's dead," Samuel whispered, though part of him had always known this day would come. "When? How long?" The third woman, older than her companions and carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had inherited authority along with her grief, shook her head slowly. "She lives, but barely. The doctors say her heart is failing, worn out from carrying the weight of a love that was never allowed to flourish. She has perhaps days, maybe weeks if she is fortunate." Samuel's legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed to his knees in the dirt beneath the tree, the rope sliding from his neck as the barrel toppled over with a hollow thud. For 60 years he had imagined this moment, the day when he would learn the fate of the woman he had loved more than his own soul. He had pictured her happy, married to someone worthy of her grace, surrounded by children and grandchildren who would carry her spirit into the future. To learn that she had lived her entire life in the shadow of his abandonment was a torture worse than any hell his fevered imagination had ever conceived. "Why are you here?" Samuel asked, though he dreaded the answer almost as much as he needed it. What could you possibly want from an old man who has already destroyed everything he ever touched? The youngest woman knelt beside him, her dark eyes studying his face with an intensity that reminded him painfully of Dancing Star's penetrating gaze. "We want you to live long enough to keep the promise you made to her beneath the August moon in 1881. We want you to honor the words you spoke when you swore that nothing in this world or the next could separate you from the woman who held your heart." Samuel closed his eyes, letting the memory wash over him like a tide of regret and longing. August of 1881, the night when Dancing Star had agreed to become his wife, despite the dangers that such a union would bring to both their peoples. They had pledged themselves to each other under a sky full of stars, speaking vows that transcended law and custom and social expectation. He had promised to love her until the mountains crumbled and the rivers ran dry, to stand by her side no matter what storms might come. I broke that promise, Samuel said, his voice heavy with the weight of decades. I abandoned her when she needed me most, left her to face the consequences of our love alone. There is no redemption for what I did, no way to undo the damage I caused. The middle woman stepped closer, and Samuel could see that she wore a necklace made from silver and turquoise, the same design that Dancing Star had been crafting during their last night together. Grandmother told us you would say that, she said with something approaching compassion. She told us you would believe that your guilt was more powerful than her forgiveness, that your shame was stronger than her love. She was wrong about many things in her life, but she was never wrong about you. Samuel looked up at the three women who had appeared like avenging angels to interrupt his final act of despair, seeing in their faces the echo of features he had memorized during stolen moments of happiness so long ago. These were Dancing Star's blood, her legacy, proof that she had found ways to create beauty and meaning, even in the absence of the man she had chosen to love. "Tell me about her," Samuel said, his voice breaking as the words emerged. "Tell me about the life she built after I destroyed everything we had planned together." The oldest woman settled cross-legged in the dirt beside him, her movements graceful, despite her obvious exhaustion from the long ride. "She never married," she began, her voice carrying the cadence of someone who had told this story many times before. She said that her heart belonged to a man who had taught her the difference between love and possession, and that she would rather live alone with beautiful memories than settle for something lesser with someone else. Samuel felt his chest constrict with a pain that was both exquisite and unbearable. She should have found someone better, someone who would have stayed and fought for her instead of running like a coward when the test came. "She became a healer," the middle woman continued, ignoring his self-recrimination. "One of the most skilled medicine women our people had ever known. She said that loving you had taught her how to see past the surface of things, how to find the wounded places in people's souls and help them begin to heal." The youngest woman reached into her saddlebag and withdrew a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. "She saved these," she said, carefully unfolding the leather to reveal a collection of items that took Samuel's breath away. There was the silver ring he had given her as a promise of their engagement, a pressed flower from the bouquet he had picked for her on their last evening together, and a photograph they had taken at a traveling photographer's studio in Cheyenne during one of their secret trips away from the disapproving eyes of both their communities. "She told us that these were proof that love like yours was real," the oldest woman said. "She said that in a world full of people who claimed to love but ran at the first sign of difficulty, you had shown her what it meant to love so deeply that it transformed you into someone new." Samuel reached out with trembling fingers to touch the photograph, seeing in the faded image two young people who believed that love could conquer any obstacle. Dancing Star looked radiant in her carefully chosen dress, her eyes bright with the happiness that came from being cherished by someone who saw her true worth. Samuel himself looked younger than he could remember ever being, his face free of the lines that guilt and regret had carved there over the decades. "I was a cavalry officer," Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Captain Samuel Harrison of the 7th Cavalry, assigned to keep the peace between the settlers and the tribes. I fell in love with a woman whose people I was supposed to be protecting from men like me." The three women listened without judgment. As Samuel began to tell the story, he had never spoken aloud, the words coming slowly at first, but gaining strength as the long-suppressed truth finally found its voice. He told them about the night he first saw Dancing Star at a trading post celebration, how her laughter had cut through the noise and chaos to reach something in his soul that he had not known existed. She was bargaining with a merchant who was trying to cheat her people, Samuel remembered, his voice growing stronger with each word. She spoke 3 languages fluently and knew the value of every item in his wagon better than he did. When she caught him trying to pass off brass as gold, she dressed him down so thoroughly that half the crowd started applauding. He described the months of secret courtship that followed, how they had met in hidden places far from the eyes of those who would never understand what they saw in each other. Dancing Star had taught him about her culture, her language, and her dreams for a future where children like theirs might grow up free from the hatred that divided their peoples. In return, he had shared his own hopes for a life built on love instead of duty, peace instead of war. "We planned to elope," Samuel continued, his voice growing heavy with the weight of memory. We were going to travel to California, where mixed marriages were more accepted, and start over completely. But 3 days before we were supposed to leave, I received orders that changed everything. The oldest woman leaned forward, her eyes intent on Samuel's face. What kind of orders? Samuel closed his eyes, seeing again the dispatch that had arrived on that terrible morning in August of 1881. Colonel Morrison had received reports of weapons being smuggled to hostile tribes through a network of sympathetic civilians. He wanted me to lead a raid on the suspected meeting point, arrest anyone involved, and confiscate any contraband we found. The middle woman's expression darkened with understanding. The meeting point was Dancing Stars Village. Samuel nodded, feeling the familiar weight of guilt settling over his shoulders like a shroud. I tried to find ways around the orders, tried to delay or redirect the mission, but Morrison was suspicious of my reluctance, and I knew that if I refused outright, he would simply send someone else, someone who would not hesitate to use maximum force against civilians. The youngest woman's eyes flashed with anger that reminded Samuel painfully of Dancing Star's fierce protective instincts. "So you chose your career over her safety?" "I chose to try to save as many lives as possible," Samuel replied, his voice steady despite the pain that lanced through his chest. I knew I could not stop the raid, but I thought I could control it, minimize the damage. I planned to arrive at the village, conduct a perfunctory search, and leave without incident. Samuel's voice broke as he remembered the moment when everything had gone wrong. But there really were weapons in the village, rifles and ammunition that Dancing Star's father had hidden to protect his people from raiders who had been terrorizing isolated settlements. When my men found the cache, they assumed they had uncovered evidence of a planned uprising. The memory of what happened next had haunted Samuel's dreams for 6 decades. His soldiers, already nervous about being outnumbered in hostile territory, had overreacted to the discovery of the weapons. Shots were fired, people scattered in panic, and within minutes, the situation had escalated into the kind of bloodbath that would be remembered as one of the darkest incidents of the Indian Wars. 17 people died that day, Samuel said, his voice barely audible, including Dancing Star's father and 2 of her brothers. She survived only because I threw myself over her when the shooting started, and even then she took a bullet in the shoulder that left her arm partially paralyzed for the rest of her life. The 3 women absorbed this information in silence, their faces reflecting the complex emotions that came with learning the full truth about events that had shaped their family's history. Samuel could see anger there, but also understanding, and perhaps even a grudging respect for the impossible position he had found himself in. "What happened after the shooting stopped?" the oldest woman asked. Samuel took a shuddering breath, preparing to confess the cowardice that had haunted him for the rest of his life. Dancing Star was unconscious from her wound, and my men were in full panic mode. Morrison arrived with reinforcements and declared the incident a successful action against hostile forces. I knew that if I tried to contradict his version of events, I would be court-martialed and possibly executed for treason. The middle woman's expression hardened. "So you said nothing?" "I said nothing," Samuel confirmed, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "I filed a report that supported Morrison's claims, accepted commendation for my leadership during the action, and watched as the massacre was recorded in official records as a legitimate military engagement." The youngest woman stood abruptly, pacing away from the group, as if she could not bear to remain still while processing this information. "And Dancing Star? What did you tell her when she woke up?" Samuel felt tears beginning to flow down his weathered cheeks. "I told her that I loved her more than my own life, but that I was too weak to fight a system that would destroy us both if we tried to seek justice for what had happened. I told her that she deserved someone braver than me, someone who would stand up for what was right, even if it cost him everything." The silence that followed stretched for long minutes, broken only by the sound of wind through the cottonwood branches and the distant lowing of cattle settling in for the night. Samuel could feel the weight of judgment from the 3 women, but also something else, a sadness that spoke of stories passed down through generations, tales of love destroyed by forces too powerful for individuals to resist. "She understood," the oldest woman said finally. "Grandmother told us that she understood why you made the choice you did. She said that loving someone sometimes means accepting that they are not strong enough to be the hero you hoped they would be." Samuel looked up in surprise. not expecting absolution from the descendants of the woman he had failed so completely. "She forgave me? She spent 60 years forgiving you," the middle woman replied. "Every day, every night, through all the years when other people told her she was foolish to cling to the memory of a man who had abandoned her when she needed him most. She said that love was not about being perfect. It was about being human enough to need forgiveness and generous enough to give it." The youngest woman returned to the group, her anger apparently transformed into something approaching compassion. "But forgiveness does not mean that your choices had no consequences. She lived her entire life alone because of what you did. She raised other people's children instead of her own, healed other people's wounds, while her own heart remained broken." Samuel nodded, accepting the truth of the accusation. "I know. I have lived with that knowledge every day since I left her. It is why I came to this tree tonight, because the weight of what I cost her had finally become more than I could bear." The oldest woman stood and walked to her horse, returning with a bundle that Samuel had not noticed before. "Before you decide that death is your only option," she said, carefully unwrapping the package, "you should know that there is still time to keep the promise you made to her beneath the August moon." Inside the bundle was a letter written in Dancing Star's careful handwriting. The paper yellowed with age, but the words still clear and strong. Samuel's hands shook as he took the letter, recognizing immediately the distinctive way she formed her letters, the slight slant that had made her writing as beautiful as her voice. "My beloved Samuel," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means that our granddaughters have found you and that my long wait is finally ending. I do not know what has become of you in the years since we were separated, but I hope that you have found some measure of peace in whatever life you chose to build without me." Samuel's vision blurred as he continued reading, seeing in every word the grace and wisdom that had first drawn him to Dancing Star all those decades ago. She wrote about the children she had raised, the community she had served, and the love that had sustained her through the lonely years. But more than that, she wrote about forgiveness, understanding, and the hope that someday they might find their way back to each other. "I know that you believe you are unworthy of love because of the choices you made during the raid," the letter continued. "But I want you to understand that I never blamed you for being human, for being afraid, for making mistakes under impossible circumstances. The man I fell in love with was not perfect. He was simply good enough to try to do the right thing, even when the right thing was unclear." The letter went on to describe Dancing Star's final wish, that Samuel would come to her before she died, not so that she could punish him for his failures, but so that she could show him the life they had created together through their separation. She had established a school for mixed heritage children, a place where young people could learn to navigate between two worlds without shame or apology. She had trained dozens of healers in the traditional ways, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. She had become a bridge between communities, helping former enemies find common ground. "All of this," the letter concluded, "was built on the foundation of love you gave me during our brief time together. You taught me that it was possible to see past differences of race and culture to the common humanity that connects all people. That lesson became the guiding principle of my life, and it has borne fruit in ways that neither of us could have imagined when we were young and thought that love was something we possessed rather than something that possessed us." Samuel finished reading the letter as the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded him of the sunrise he had shared with Dancing Star on their last morning together. The three women had waited in respectful silence while he absorbed their grandmother's final words, their faces patient but expectant. "She wants to see me," Samuel said, though it was more statement than question. "She is dying," the youngest woman replied. "The doctors say it is a matter of days, perhaps a week at most. We have traveled for 3 days to find you, and we will need another 3 to get back to the reservation where she is being cared for." Samuel looked at the rope that still lay coiled beside the overturned barrel, then at the letter that had transformed his understanding of everything he thought he knew about love, forgiveness, and redemption. The choice before him was clear. He could complete the act of self-destruction that the three women had interrupted, or he could find the courage to face the woman he had loved and failed and somehow betrayed himself again. "Will you come with us?" the oldest woman asked. "Will you give her the chance to see the man she never stopped loving?" To share with you the legacy that your love created even in your absence? Samuel struggled to his feet, his joints protesting after the long night of kneeling in the dirt. His body felt every one of its 71 years, but his spirit felt lighter than it had in decades. The burden of guilt he had carried was still there, but it was no longer the only weight in his chest. Dancing Star's letter had planted something new, a seed of hope that perhaps love could survive even the worst failures of courage and character. "I will come," Samuel said, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "I will keep the promise I made, even if I am 60 years too late." The middle woman smiled, and Samuel saw in her expression the same radiant joy that had once lit Dancing Star's face when she looked at him. "It is never too late to come home," she said. "Love like yours does not recognize the boundaries of time or space. It simply waits, patient and eternal, for the moment when the heart is finally ready to return." Samuel gathered a few belongings from his house. The photograph he had carried for 60 years. The ring Dancing Star had returned to him during their final meeting, and the journal where he had written letters to her that he had never sent. The three women waited while he saddled his best horse, a gray mare named Redemption, who had been his companion for the past 15 years. As they rode away from the ranch that had been his sanctuary and his prison, Samuel felt the weight of the noose around his neck being replaced by something infinitely lighter, the sensation of breathing freely for the first time in decades. Behind them, the cottonwood tree stood empty against the morning sky, its branches reaching toward heaven like arms raised in benediction or surrender. The journey to the reservation took 3.5 days, during which Samuel learned about the 3 women who had saved his life, and perhaps his soul. The oldest was called Moonbeam, a nurse who had dedicated her career to serving rural communities where medical care was scarce and expensive. The middle woman was known as Starlight, a teacher who had spent 20 years preserving traditional languages and stories that were in danger of being lost forever. The youngest was named Sunrise, a college student studying law so that she could fight for the rights of indigenous peoples in courtrooms and legislative chambers. Each of them carried part of Dancing Star's legacy, and through their words, Samuel began to understand the profound impact that their grandmother had made during her long life. She had touched hundreds of lives through her work as a healer, educator, and community leader. She had raised a generation of young people who understood the value of both tradition and progress. She had become a living bridge between the world that was passing away and the world that was being born. "She never spoke of you with bitterness," Starlight told him, during their second night around the campfire. "Even when people urged her to forget you and find someone else, she would say that love was not something you could turn on and off like a lamp. She said that real love changes you permanently, becomes part of who you are, and that she would rather be alone with beautiful memories than settle for something ordinary with someone else." Samuel stared into the flames, seeing in their dance the echo of fires he had shared with Dancing Star during their brief courtship. "I destroyed her chance for happiness. She could have had 12 children, a house full of grandchildren, a husband who would have stood by her through everything. She did have all of those things," Sunrise said firmly, "just not in the way that most people would recognize. The children she raised loved her as fiercely as if she had given birth to them. The community she served became her extended family. And you, even in your absence, you were her husband in every way that mattered. She wore your ring on a chain around her neck for 60 years, and she spoke of you as if you had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any time." Moonbeam reached into her pack and withdrew a small wooden box that she handled with obvious reverence. "She asked us to give this to you when we found you," she said, offering the box to Samuel with both hands. She said it contained the most important thing she had ever owned. Samuel opened the box with trembling fingers, finding inside a collection of items that told the story of a love that had transcended time and space. There were the letters he had written to her during their courtship, carefully preserved despite their age. There was a pressed flower from the bouquet he had given her on their last evening together. There was a small piece of leather bearing the image of 2 hearts intertwined, something she had been crafting as a wedding gift that would never be exchanged. But at the bottom of the box, wrapped in silk that had once been white but had yellowed with age, was something that took Samuel's breath away completely. It was a tiny moccasin, no bigger than his thumb, decorated with beadwork in the pattern that Dancing Star had told him represented new life and infinite possibility. She made it for the child she hoped you would have together, Moonbeam explained, her voice gentle but matter-of-fact. She finished it during the weeks after the raid, while she was recovering from her wound and learning to accept that your future together would take a different form than either of you had expected. Samuel held the tiny moccasin in his palm, feeling the weight of dreams that had never been realized and love that had never been allowed to flourish. The beadwork was exquisite, each tiny bead placed with the precision that came from hands guided by hope rather than despair. He could imagine Dancing Star working on this project during the long nights when pain and grief made sleep impossible, creating something beautiful from the ashes of everything they had lost. Why did she keep it? Samuel asked, though he was not sure he wanted to know the answer. Because she said that love like yours creates life, even when it cannot create children, Starlight replied. She said that every person she healed, every child she taught, every bridge she built between communities was part of the family you had created together. The moccasin was her reminder that love is not just about what you receive. It is about what you give to the world, because love has made you more than you were before. Samuel carefully returned the moccasin to its place in the box, understanding for the first time that his relationship with Dancing Star had not ended with their separation. It had simply taken a different form, one that he had been too consumed with guilt to recognize. She had spent 60 years building a life that honored the love they had shared, while he had spent the same 60 years punishing himself for not being brave enough to fight for that love when it was threatened. On the 4th day of their journey, they finally reached the reservation where Dancing Star was spending her final days. Samuel's first impression was of a community that had found ways to preserve its identity while adapting to the changing world around it. Children played in yards where traditional dwellings stood alongside modern houses, their laughter mixing with the sound of elders speaking in languages that had survived centuries of attempts at eradication. Dancing Star was being cared for in a small house overlooking a valley where wildflowers bloomed in patterns that seemed to have been arranged by an artist's hand. Samuel's heart pounded as they approached the door, 60 years of longing and regret compressed into a single moment of anticipation and terror. "She has been waiting for you," Moonbeam said as she opened the door. "She may not have much time left, but she has been holding on for this moment." Samuel stepped across the threshold and found himself in a room that felt like a shrine to their lost love. The walls were covered with photographs from their brief courtship, artwork that Dancing Star had created during the decades of their separation, and mementos from the life she had built in his absence. But his attention was immediately drawn to the bed where Dancing Star lay propped against pillows, her silver hair spread around her shoulders like a crown. She looked smaller than he remembered, diminished by age and illness, but her eyes still held the same intelligence and warmth that had first captured his heart all those years ago. When she saw him standing in the doorway, she smiled with an expression of such pure joy that Samuel felt his knees buckle with the weight of emotion. "Samuel Two Bears Harrison," she said, her voice weaker than it had once been, but still carrying the musical quality that had haunted his dreams. "You came back to me." Samuel crossed the room slowly, afraid that sudden movement might shatter the dream that had brought him back to her. "I should have come back 60 years ago," he said, his voice breaking as the words emerged. "I should have been brave enough to fight for us instead of running away when things became difficult." Dancing Star reached out with a hand that trembled with age and illness, touching his face with fingers that still carried the calluses from a lifetime of healing work. "You came back when I needed you most," she said. "You came back when it was time for us to finish the story we started so long ago." Samuel took her hand in both of his, feeling the familiar spark that had connected them across decades of separation. "I read your letter. I saw what you built with the love we shared. I understand now that I was wrong to believe that my failures had destroyed everything we created together." Dancing Star's eyes filled with tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Love like ours does not die," she said. "It transforms, it grows, it finds new ways to express itself. The life I built was not separate from our love. It was the fullest expression of everything you taught me about seeing past differences to the common humanity that connects all people." Samuel spent the next 3 days at Dancing Star's bedside, listening to the stories of the life she had built, and sharing with her the decades of loneliness and regret that had driven him to the edge of despair. They talked about the children they had never had, the dreams they had never realized, and the love that had somehow grown stronger during their years apart. "I want you to promise me something," Dancing Star said on what would prove to be their final evening together. "I want you to promise that you will not waste the years you have left, feeling guilty about the choices you made when you were young and afraid. I want you to live long enough to see the good that can still come from our love." Samuel held her hand as the sun set over the valley, where wildflowers bloomed in patterns that seemed designed by an artist who understood the beauty that could emerge from even the most difficult circumstances. "What kind of good? What more could possibly come from something I damaged so completely?" Dancing Star smiled with the secret knowledge of someone who had spent a lifetime watching love work in mysterious ways. "Our granddaughters are planning to establish a foundation in our name," she said. "A place where couples separated by war or prejudice can find support and healing. They want you to help them, to share your story so that other people can learn that love is worth fighting for, even when the battle seems impossible to win." Samuel felt something stirring in his chest that he had not experienced in decades, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival, a reason to continue living that had nothing to do with avoiding death and everything to do with creating something meaningful from the wreckage of his choices. "The native girls saved the veteran rancher," Dancing Star whispered, as her breathing grew shallow and her grip on his hand began to weaken. "Or maybe they just needed him alive a little longer to help them plant seeds that will bloom long after we are both gone." Dancing Star passed away, just as the first stars appeared in the clear night sky, her hand still clasped in Samuel's as her spirit joined the ancestors who had been waiting to welcome her home. Samuel felt her leaving like a physical pain, but also like a completion, the end of a long exile, and the beginning of a new understanding of what it meant to love completely. The foundation that Moonbeam, Starlight, and Sunrise established in honor of their grandmother and the man she had never stopped loving became one of the most successful organizations of its kind, helping hundreds of couples navigate the challenges of love that crossed cultural and racial boundaries. Samuel lived for 7 more years, long enough to see the first generation of children who grew up believing that love was more powerful than prejudice, that understanding was more valuable than hatred. When Samuel finally joined Dancing Star, in whatever realm awaits those who love truly and completely, the 3 women who had saved him from the cottonwood tree stood beside his grave and spoke the words that had guided their grandmother through 60 years of faithful waiting. "Love like this does not die. It simply transforms. It grows. It finds new ways to express itself in the world." The veteran rancher, who had been saved by 3 native girls, or who had perhaps simply been needed alive a little longer to fulfill a destiny that had been written in the stars, left behind a legacy that proved love could survive any obstacle if it was patient enough to wait for its moment to bloom again.